So thank you all very much for coming this morning. As I'm sure you're all aware, this is the third session, I better get the title right, on unsettling development through centering environmental justice, organised by members of the Environment, Natural Resources and Climate Change Study Group. So we have four presentations now, but I think 3 of the speakers are here. So I think we'll move straight on to the first one. Abhinita, if that's okay with you, Abhinita. If you could say a few words about yourself at the beginning, that would be great to get to know you a little bit. And so that's 15 minutes, and we'll have a few minutes for any questions for clarification after each presentation, then we'll have questions and discussion at the end. And as we've been doing in the other sessions, if we could turn our videos off as well as mute ourselves when the speaker is giving the presentation, that will make things easier for everyone. But please do put your videos on if you can when we're having the discussion later. So over to you, Abhinita. Is that okay? Are you okay with sharing your screen and everything?
Yeah, so hi everyone, how are you? Good? Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah, we're fine, we're fine.
Yeah,
Yes.
yeah. So yeah,
I'll just hang on for a bit until you've shared your screen, okay?
Yeah, so I have a pre-recorded presentation.
Oh, okay,
so,
right, pre-recorded presentation, okay.
Yeah, and I'm a research scholar. I work, so I'm in the Department of Humanities and Social Sciences in Madras, India. And I'm working on food sovereignty and the tribals in a district in Orissa, and Orissa is in the eastern part of India. So, and my fieldwork was interrupted by the pandemics. So whatever data I've collected, so I'm presenting it and trying to link it, the idea of food sovereignty. So I'll start my presentation now.
Thank you.
This is a food system in which the people who produce, distribute, and consume food also control the mechanism and policies of food production. It's the right of the people to healthy and culturally appropriate food produced through ecologically sound and sustainable methods. And it stands in contrast to corporate food regimes and control of global food systems and market over local food systems. So here you can see the maps of Orissa and Rayagada district. My fieldwork was mainly based in Munigoda and Bisam Katak, which I have highlighted in yellow. In this picture, which was taken early morning in a corn village, the villagers are ready to sell cotton to a trader or a middleman who is in the village to collect the produce. 99% of all cotton cultivation is BT cotton. It is the second most cultivated food crops. The first is millets, which is a traditional food crop for corns. The BT cotton seeds are not just a threat to the local food system, but are also water guzzling in nature and often push farmers to opt for non-institutional credit, putting them into debt trap. It alters crop diversity, soil structures, and threatens farmers' independence and makes them vulnerable to food insecurity. This image contests the popular idea that corns are primitive, because the transition to a capitalist system is gradually making inroads in the villages, and it is a seamless transition, though there exists a hybridity of primitive animistic culture and that of its connection to the global food system and the market system. Corn festivals revolve around agrarian life cycles. Seeds and tradition of preserving seeds play a vital role and symbolizes agroecology and balance between different elements of nature. These ancient rituals remain as if a subtle resistance to neoliberalizing tendency and globalization of foods. In the image, local leaf varieties, fika and paraka leaves, are used as containers. The basket consists of millets, rice, vegetable seeds, oil seeds, pulses, corns, and tubers, and it's celebrated in the month of April. Food sovereignty actors in the region recognize that such festivals have potential to revive corn agroecology and generate awareness and activism built around encouraging local food systems. Women play a very important role in corn community. They are the primary seed savers and have knowledge on corn methods of sustainable and agroecological practices. Bejuni, or the high priestess, leads the rituals in festivities and weddings and decides the date and time of the festivals in consultation with others in the village. These women are usually older and know the method of healing. Corn healing practices rely on roots, leaves, flowers, and tubers. However, with depleting forest resources and the Forest Rights Act, free access to this is not always possible today. The festival begins with cleaning the mud walls with cow dung and painting the wall with motifs. Women clean seeds from husks, choose the best quality seeds, which takes years of hard work and technique. Then they carry them in earthen pots and go from one village to another. And in this process, exchange of seeds takes place between different villages. This is a traditional method of seed conservation. It's a container made up of bamboos and laid with mud, neem leaves, or margosa leaves, and cow dung. And in some cases, may contain certain roots. And seeds are put inside it. It is stored in a warm, dry area of the house or in the backyard during summer. This protects them from rodents and moisture. Today, one sees shacks of BT cotton occupying more space than such bamboo containers. Corns cherish the corns celebrate and cherish their seeds. It brings together different communities and villages, and their festival challenge the contemporary world of widening inequalities and drastic individualism. The holistic community well-being reflects on the well-being of the universe. However, cons are also embarrassing global capitalism and are very much a part of the market system. This image shows the ritual of feeding rice and millets to chicken and slaughtering it with a belief that its blood will make the land fertile and yield healthy food. In the villages close to the market and the town of the Bisamkatak area, such festivals have become more about feasting and less about the ritualistic aspect. Being in a neoliberal economy means that access to money is the only way to secure access to basic needs such as farm inputs, health, and education. The cons thus see the only way to gain fast cash is by cultivating in eucalyptus and BT cotton. Another reason for changing food practices is a PDS, or public distribution system. PDS is a government-sponsored scheme which provides rice to those below the poverty line in according to the number of members in the family. Hence, instead of millet, which was their primary food, rice is now dominating the food scene in most villages. The food system is transitioning from codependency on nature to that of simply productivity and quantity. Discussing the mechanism of cotton and eucalyptus trading, here a variety of actors come into the scene, cutting across class, caste, and region, and this is where the process of commercialization and neoliberal power structure play a role. There are two major castes in Raigada district. One is Sundhis, or the other backward class, and the Dalits, or traditionally considered untouchables. They stay in and around tribal villages, and Dalits are seen by tribals as resourceful and clever. Sundhis usually play the role of a middleman for big traders, and sometimes Dalits may do the same. Almost twice a year, a trader himself or his middleman comes to the village to offer corn's input, such as BT cotton seeds and herbicides, after which they come back again to collect the produce. The final price they offer will be an amount after cuts for the advanced inputs and they also add an interest. The farmers usually make 4,000 to 5,000 rupees per quintal, and majority of them get a marginal profit. Sometimes they may incur loss, and sometimes it's neither. In case of eucalyptus, often they prefer to lease out their lands to local paper mills or traders from the neighboring state of Andhra Pradesh and Telangana. After the contract expires, usually 5 to 15 years, the farmers realize that the land is bereft of nutrients and fertility due to the use of chemicals. They gain financial benefits or cash, but they lose their only asset, making them vulnerable to food insecurity. Increasing cultivation of BT cotton and other commercial crops has led to the use of harmful pesticides and seeds. In the images, you can see two banned substances, BG2 cotton seeds and glyphosate. They're banned in most parts of India and in Odisha. BG2 seeds are herbicide resistant, and glyphosate is carcinogenic to humans. Glyphosate is also at the center of a multi-billion-dollar lawsuits filed by cancer patients in the country of its origin, the United States. Cons call it ghasmara in the local language, literally meaning the killers of grass, weeds, and useful nutrients. The BG2 cotton varieties found even in the remote parts of Niyamgiri Hills are mostly without price tags and expiry dates. In Kond community, as in most tribal communities, women do a majority of work, which includes both household work and agricultural labor. Konds practice two kinds of farming. One is dongar or hill cultivation, known as dongar chasa, a form of shifting cultivation, and another is cultivation on plains. Traditionally, the emphasis was on dongar chasa or shifting cultivation, where most of the crops was used for private consumption and few were sold in the market. No one owned the dongar or hills, and it was a concept which was alien to the tribes. When plain cultivation became the center of commercial activities and leasing land or renting them began, it led to a system of land ownership, which passed from one generation of men to another and mostly excluded women. Very few women today own land in these. Entrenchment of global food system and market system into remote corn villages have not just proved environmentally hazardous, but has also sharpened social hierarchies, subverted the customary rights of tribal women, and led to the emergence of new power structures. The emergence of multiple power sources is giving rise to conflict over scarce resources. The conflict between Konds and Dalits, though implicit, influences the relations of production and access to resources. Traditionally, Dalits, whom Konds see as untouchables, worked as mediators between Konds and the outside world. They would procure dry fish, liquor, biddies or smoke, etc. from market for the tribals. Some of them grazed cows for the villages in exchange for grains or cash. The Konds see Dalits as worldly and closer to the modern world and administration. In 1960s and 70s until 90s, Dalits were able to take advantage of reservation and the political climate which favored them. They also speak the Odia language, in contrary to Konds, who are mostly fluent in Kui languages and are just learning Odia. As most Dalits don't own land, they took up small jobs or became middlemen for big traders who exploited Konds. Even Sundhis joined them. Today, Konds don't simply see Dalits as untouchables, but also view them suspiciously. At the same time, both are codependent on each other. The Konds depend on Dalits for access to the market system and traders, and the Dalit depend on cones for their livelihood and when they need to lease their land. So the different groups in the region are undergoing mutations in their relationship due to the capitalist mode of production, which emphasizes more on productivity than on environmental justice or communitarian welfare. The value system and the rich heritage of knowledge of agroecology, which Combs cherish and practice, are excluded in this modern development paradigm. Though the tribals are conscious of the environmental degradation and destruction that the new world has given them, most of them embrace its perks of materialism while remaining wary of its dangers on their lifestyle and land. The Dongoria Khans in Niyamgiri fought a successful battle against Vedanta, a multinational steel corporation, and protected their sacred hill Niyam Raja. They invoked their rights as Adivasis, the divinity of forests, and played out scenes from the movie Avatar to garner worldwide support. Women continue to preserve seeds and take lead in all rituals and festivities, despite the neoliberal economy trying to exclude them in its development process. The seed festivals and revival of a number of heirloom millets and rice varieties in recent years is a ray of hope. Thanks to a number of scientists and activists, social workers who are actively encouraging Combs to go for heirloom seeds. In my field work, I came across farmers who have been able to save around 72 varieties of seeds and have grown them successfully on the rugged terrain of their hills. In 2017, when farmers in coastal districts of Orissa were reeling under drought and committing suicide, the corn farmers remained insulated, largely due to their access to forest produce and growing drought-resistant and flood-resistant millet varieties. And as the farmer puts it, tubers and spinach and the forest saved them. So, can food sovereignty be an alternative movement and establish new development paradigm? Can it feed the world? Food sovereignty has been accused of not giving enough attention to the needs of workers and agricultural laborers, which is not true in this context, in the context of Orissa, where such dichotomies are fuzzy. But the real challenge is, can food sovereignty integrate theoretical framework with new patterns of needs and negotiate local hierarchies successfully, especially in a country like India, with its unique system of caste rules and gender hierarchies? How will local actors ensure equal access to land and protection from exploitation? Lastly, as Tanya Morelli puts it, is it possible for small farmers without much resources, state support, or subsidies to have the privilege of making choices regarding their own food systems? Thank you for listening to me.
Thank you so much. That was really fascinating, Avanita. Any questions? Could you stop sharing your screen and then maybe we can just see if there's any questions for clarification? And well done for getting through those technological challenges. I think we all learned something about sharing the sound there.
Yes, can I ask a question?
Yeah.
Yeah, amidst this conflict between perhaps two different systems of land use, what is the capacity and effort to fulfill their own food needs without dependence on external markets, just for their own food needs?
Okay, so yeah. So the tribals in this area, they are still cultivating a lot of food crops for private consumption on the hills. And I was telling, and as I said that in 2017, when there was a famine in Orissa, and especially the coastal part was affected, it was expected that in these hilly regions with irregular rainfalls and lack of any alternate irrigation facilities, these tribals would face a huge problem. But fortunately, they didn't, because of the fact that they were still growing food, and also despite cotton cultivation, despite eucalyptus, they still had access to forest resources. But the problem is that due to the recent Forest Rights Act, there have been some restrictions on farmers, especially in the past few years regarding access to forests. So that makes them more vulnerable to food insecurity. But the thing is that right now, they're still trying to, straddle both worlds together. So maybe a decade from now, you're not sure that where it will go. Yes.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, so thank you very much for that presentation, Abenita. That was really fascinating. So we'll come over to you now, Les, for you to give us your presentation. If you could introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about yourself as well, that would be great.
Carlos, your microphone is okay.
Ah, sorry, so you didn't hear my commentary, but anyway, all will be explained from the film. So to conserve is to resist. Traditional communities mobilizing agri-food and musical cultures for socio-environmental justice. And presentation mode, where do I click? Oh, there, there it is. Yeah, here we are. Right. Here we are. That's the title of our project, Agro-Ecos, which is a play on words, Ecologias Economia Solidaria, or Ecosol, and echoes, meaning practices that echo and reproduce across space and time. So the title of our project, Agroecology-Based Solidarity Economy in Bolivia and Brazil. So this talk gives a retrospective view from before the COVID-19 crisis. In one case study area, the Bocaina, which is within the Litoral Norte, northern coast between Sao Paulo and Rio de Janeiro. So explain what are comunidades tradicionais. In many coastal areas, diverse traditional communities have gained livelihoods from resource-light activities for centuries. Since the beginning of the Brazilian Empire, colonizing that area, but they lack security of land tenure or security of resource access. This has been jeopardized by several changes: real estate development, predatory tourism, and capital-intensive agriculture. So the concept traditional communities highlights their communal use and sustainable management of natural resources. They have incorporated new collective identities stimulated by territorial conflicts and regular mobilizations to defend land rights, thus going beyond anything that was traditional before these conflicts. these pervasive conflicts are exemplified by the Bakaina coastal subregion, Bakaina named after the Parque Nacional, national park, shown in that red area, and including 3 main towns. The film showed you the 10th anniversary festival of the Forum de Comunidades Tradicionais, hence FCT plus 10. So it was established in 2006. It built unity among the 3 traditional communities in the Bakaina, the indigenous Guarani, the Quilombolas, who are descendants of the escaped slaves, and Caiçaras, descendants of Portuguese settlers who stayed in areas remote from the Brazilian Empire and mixed with the other 2 groups. So the FCT has promoted intra-community solidarity through cooperative initiatives to protect natural resources, develop agroecological agroforestry, and to build community-based tourism as means to oppose various threats. There were 2 main mottos: socio-environmental justice, to clarify the social justice aspect, and to conserve is to resist, as in preservar et resistir, in defense of traditional territories, as you saw in the banners in the film, and the logo and symbolizes the unity of the 3 traditional communities, all united partly through agroforestry. They've renewed their traditional musical cultures, which remain strongly grounded in dance, as you saw in the film. These have been shared at public festivals, education programs, political protests, and FCT events. And I'd love to show you more films, but we'll move on. The FCT coordinator said it is not easy to bring together the 3 groups given their different cultures, but we are taking important steps. He's speaking perhaps overly modestly about their impressive efforts. So I pose these 2 questions. How do the 3 communities link their agri-food musical cultures in old and new forms? How do they mobilize such cultures to defend their territory, resist the dominant development model, and create alternatives? For several centuries, these communities have continued their traditional lives, featuring light agroforestry, fishing, and crafts, which were later called artisanal in order to distinguish them from the industrialized methods of producing similar products. The area had difficult access from cities, and this helped to avoid the conflicts which have arisen since in the 1970s, when the Rio Santos motorway was built and facilitated urbanization and civil construction, which was associated with predatory tourism and second homes. And so people who lived in the cities rather than in the Bakaina. So new financial incentives, partly from government subsidies and from real estate development, sharpened the long-standing conflicts over land, which of course went back to the Portuguese Empire. The violent methods often expelled many residents and kept everyone under continuous insecurity. Deprived of land access, many residents found low-paid, insecure work in larger towns to earn a living, while others sought to remain on the land and gain livelihoods there. But how? Under all these threats. The so-called development inflicted much environmental degradation, which after protests led the government to establish unidades de conservação, conservation areas. But these often overlap with the lands of the traditional communities, thus jeopardizing their resource access. This is an environmental colonization based on the myth of untouched nature, which therefore must be preserved. So this denied the everyday conservation activity by communities who use those resources in the forest. The FCT contested that policy and eventually gained a multi-actor shared management of these conservation areas. And then that gave them a greater opportunity to develop sistemas agroforestais, agroforestry systems, linking nature conservation, better income, and the community's traditional way of life. And for this effort, they developed a partnership with civil society networks, especially the Observatorio de Territorios Sustentables de Bocaina, which is our research partner with the FCT in the Bocaina. Now, they together, those two partners, conceptualized the threat as continuing the colonial model from the Portuguese Empire. But given the systematic harm from this dominant model, the FCT blames modern thought, that is the modernization model, for this colonizing role. And they draw on many academic writers who say, for example, homogenizing colonialist attitude historically erased ethnic cultural diversities, diluting them in classifications which emphasize the subordination of the natives, wild and illiterate, who lack the erudite knowledge of the colonizer. These colonial zones continue today, constituting the contemporary system of so-called modernization. So these threats warrant an alternative development model as resistance strategy. And in particular, they've developed agroforestry with a community nursery to develop forest plants as a basis for distinctive foods of their cultures. These were eventually showcased by a new community-based tourism. This expands short supply chains for a solidarity economy through travel guides, restaurants, and festivals. These initiatives formed a wider network with the Nandareco Guarani concept, meaning we share our way of being with visitors. In this way, the various villages of the three communities shared their experiences in order to strengthen their own internal democracy, income generation, and resistance against external threats of losing access to their land or resources. And here's a regional conference they held on community-based tourism, and an example of a storytelling session, spanning the three traditional communities. They've also demanded differentiated educating, meaning distinctive to each culture. And the partnership began to win such demand several years ago. So the schools began a new curriculum emphasizing cultural identity, autonomy, and belonging. The education now links music, artisanal heritages, agri-food traditions, and so on, to strengthen capacities for territorial defense and alternative development pathways. Now, since the coup d'etat against President Dilma Rousseff in 2016, the right-wing governments have weakened the gains from the previous governments led by the Workers' Party. So more threats and thus protests have intensified. The dominant agenda has sought to change the ecological zoning of the northern coast in order to permit new construction by real estate companies. So here's a Guarani protest against that agenda for coastal rezoning and a constitutional amendment, which would strengthen the role of the federal government to override objections from the local government. Now, I have much detail on each of the three communities, but there won't be enough time. So I'll just try to be very selective and then jump to the conclusion. So as I mentioned before, the Guaranis faced greater conflicts over land access since 2016, especially because the relevant agencies delayed decisions about giving legal title, demarcating the land that would be protected for the Guarani. And at the bottom here, you see that their combined music and dance features the Emborai, the Hondara dance, where the youth imagine seeking and reaching a land without evils. And they've used that dance in their various protests in public places. And here in defense of CESI, the health agency that deals especially with indigenous communities, was threatened with abolition under the Bolsonaro government. So the communities occupied the intercity highway to draw attention to their demand. And here, the federal police tried to just push away the protests blocking the highway. Then the Guarani then perform continuously this Hondarai dance just in the middle of the roads. It's preventing the federal police from evicting them. And here's just a translation of the song that they sing at many of these protests. We have power when we are all together. We sing this music to be happy. And then a slogan from placards: the indigenous people are here in Paraty from 5 villages. They're demanding demarcation for their indigenous land, and also indigenous health, that is health services specific to them, and also the protection of pensions, which are being threatened. The Quilombolos comes from the refuges called quilombos in remote forest areas, where the slaves set up their own communities. So today they're called quilombolos. In the 1988 Constitution requires the public authorities to grant titles to lands occupied by them, but this has been hardly implemented, with one exception. The Campiño de Independencia gained title in 99. And so they became the leading force to create a new development model led by communities, initially sharing the management and conservation areas, and then developing community-based tourism as a means to increase their income on an environmentally sustainable basis, while also opposing mass tourism. So here's the Restaurante de Colombo de Campiño. And their Django is their dance combined with song, cantico or ponto, which you saw in the film, based on African forms, of course, sung by slaves in penitentiary work and later in neighborhood cooperation. The post-harvest festivals then invite the nearby Casares and Quilombolas. Django plays many social roles in communal relationships, socialization of youth, prophecy, which also has a self-fulfilling character, and as exemplified by the lyrics of this particular cantico, which assert an autonomous collective authority. Quote, I asked the Queen of the Sea for leave to save our people. At the edge of the sea, I saw a warrior who played the bugle. Like his entire army, he fights for me, meaning for us, as the Quilombolas. And recently, the Django has been renewed, or let's say updated, through rap. I'd love to show you the film, but there won't be time. But it's interesting. The most prominent group is called Grupo Realidade Negra, that is Black reality, to confront the reality of institutional racism and to assert their territorial claims through court procedures and protests, which then give an extra political significance to Django and rap. The Caiçaras were descendants of the Portuguese immigrants who lived on the coast, far from the centers of the empire. They were described by an anthropologist as a marginal type of free peasant fisher inside a slave society. They integrated their traditional customs, from Portugal, with those of other coastal groups. Then were able to continue their artisanal practices and access to local forest resources until the 1970s, when they were marginalized by so-called modernization, as I mentioned before. This development removed access to land that they had traditionally cultivated, and thus weakened the basis for mufayao, meaning joint work. It comes from a Guarani term for mutual aid. Potential income from tourism provoked competition among the Caiçaras, thus undermining their communal relationships. And I'll jump now to the lyrics of a couple of the Caiçara songs. One sardonic song describes a tourist hotspot, Sad Wolf Street, where a shark lives, and where tourists discover a paradise, concealing the dispossession of the Caiçaras, from which they were violently evicted. Another song laments an individualist destruction of palm trees in order to extract the palm hearts and illegally sell them. quote from the song, "This purchase of palmito is worse than being a prisoner. Whoever cuts down the tree gains nothing. Those who buy the palmito make the money. It would be better to stop this trade." And the main target of this plunder was the Jusara tree, which is crucial for forest biodiversity. Its fruit has many healthful benefits and so gains a high price, but you see who benefits from that price. So as a collective solution to this problem, the FCT initiated Progetto Jusara, which is that fruit high on the palm tree. And this aimed to protect the standing tree, to deter its plunder by people cutting it down, and to valorize the health benefits. And the cooperatives have been selling the fruit pulp in shops and export markets, generating income for the managers, that is these cooperatives of the protected forest, and likewise income for the businesses that process the pulp into food products. They've also popularized recipes for making tasty products from the pulp. They hold annual Jusara festivals, which again further popularize the recipes and bring together all three communities with their musical cultures. So I'll now jump to the conclusion. This sub-region exemplifies many coastal areas where traditional communities face threats from development as modernization. It has been colonizing their everyday lives in all the ways listed there. So in response, inter-community activities have redefined collective identities while politically transforming tradition for solidaristic relationships in both old and new forms. Their strategies have drawn on counter-hegemonic concepts from Brazilian writers in engagement with such resistance. Under the motto of Justiça Socioambiental, socio-environmental justice, the FCT has brought together the three traditional groups through joint activities. All the groups maintain their musical traditions, grounded in dance. The lyrics have metaphorical, ironic, or elusive forms, especially alluding to resistance by them collectively. The musical traditions help to maintain and extend mutirao, that is mutual aids, joint work, which has been central to their agri-food systems. These community bonds have been mobilized to defend state services against attacks since 2016, to defend access to natural resources, and to defend their territory. Likewise, to create alternative development pathways based on agroforestry. As in the slogan, to conserve is to resist. This can be seen as a decolonial kind of resistance conservation. Their inter-community solidarity helps to counter the prevalent modernization model and to create novel alternatives. Musical and agri-food cultures have been mobilized in ways gaining a new significance as a collective resource for alternative development pathways. In these ways, diverse traditions converge into a composite culture. That's a quote from this sociologist, Culturas Compostas, deepening the social basis of territorial belonging. So I finished there. And I published a short article, which I'll put in the chat.
Thank you very much, Les. That was great. Any questions for clarification to Les before we go on to the third presentation?
I had a question, Fiona. Sorry.
Okay, Naomi.
I was trying to find the button to put my hand up. But, it was, yeah, I was interested to hear how these communities define themselves as traditional and what the traditional label means to them. I wonder whether that label is also used by the state and perhaps in different ways to mean different things. So that's probably less of a clarification,
Yes.
more of a discussion question.
Yes, well, in fact, this has been a big debate in Brazil for a long time, because at least under the Workers' Party government, they set up a commission to identify ways of supporting, helping traditional communities. But this had some, let's say, internal contradictions, because tradition or traditional has generally been identified with backwardness, right? And therefore people need help to become modern. And that was in tension with a different understanding that traditions provide resources for an alternative development pathway. that preserves what's valuable about those traditions, especially mutual aid as the potential for mass democratically accountable forms of organization. So yes, you're right. And that tension continues, well, even more so since the end of the PT government and the right-wing governments since 2016. But I mean, the one writer I quoted emphasized the tradition as a resource that can be renewed in, well, whatever word to use, modern in a different sense, in creating their own solidarity economy, which then extend those traditional values and make them intercommunal, across all the traditional communities, and then forge links with the people outside those communities, say through community-based tourism.
Okay, thank you very much, Les. That's great. Okay, I think we'll go on to our final presentation by Daniel Zip. Hi, Daniel.
Hi.
Okay.
I'm used to going last with the last name Zip. Wow.
Okay, but by no means Lee. So I'll leave it to you to share your screen, and if you could introduce yourself, that would be great. Thank you.
Awesome. Well, thank you very much for that introduction. And I don't know if you'll hold off on saying last but not least until the end. But I am Daniel Zip. I'm a PhD candidate at the University of California, Los Angeles, in the sociology department. And this is part of my dissertation research. So this particular talk is called Extracting Resistance, Coal, Environmental Policy, and Economic Development in the Chinese Hinterland. So while other presenters today have been talking about resistance being outside of the state, I'm going to focus on resistance within the state towards environmental policy. So anthropomorphic climate change has then threatened the future of humanity and the planet. And this is caused mostly by the burning of fossil fuels to industrially develop economies. So environmental destruction has increased rapidly over the last 40 years. And there is nowhere that this is more apparent than in China, where over the last 40 years, we've seen, on one hand, rapid economic development from sort of a global backwaters to the second largest economy in the world, to also, on the other hand, severe ecological crises. So how individual countries govern their environment and their economy, therefore, is no longer simply a question of who can economically develop the fastest, but rather it necessitates a profound break from past political and economic models of development. And this, like all change, has garnered some resistance. But let's talk about this environmental damage in China due to rapid industrialization. So China's environmental crisis is one of the most pressing challenges to emerge from the country's rapid industrialization. The China miracle, a sustained economic rise in which GDP grew on average 10% each year for decades, has come at the expense of its environment and public health. The air quality of many of its major cities fails to meet international health standards. And life expectancy in northern China, where coal is used more frequently, is 5.5 years lower than in the south. So China is the world's largest coal producer and consumer, and therefore one of the worst polluters. My favorite example of this is a New York Times headline from 2013, which said on a scale of 0 to 500, Beijing's air quality tops crazy bad at 755. This is something that the US Embassy in Beijing tweeted out, that the air quality today is crazy bad, which is not something you want to hear if you are China. So since 2014, China has tried to move away from its reliance on coal. there's been a concerted effort to promote sustainable energy policies that sought to decrease coal production and consumption, thus curbing air pollution, while increasing the amount of renewables in the energy mix. The most notable policies are through the 5-year plan and a bunch of these strategic action plans for energy development, 4 revolutions and 1 cooperation, the 5-in-1 plan. And as you can see, they generally worked. So from 2013 to 2016, there was a decrease in coal production, but something interesting happens. And in 2017, 2018, 2019, and 2020, we see an increase in coal production. So that leads to, why is there an increase in economic policy, environmental economic policy making, and a decrease in environmental economic policy enactment, especially considering the institutional arrangements in China with Xi Jinping and the tightening of policy enactment? So what does the sudden and enthusiastic implementation of environmental policies tell us about Chinese state processes and the role of the central state's designs, incentives, pressures, and interests in meso-level implementation? The central state designs policies and it has to be enacted by somebody. And it's usually enacted by these meso-level actors, who I'll get into in a second. And finally, the last sort of overarching question that my dissertation asks is why, after a brief but profound period of steadfast adherence to Beijing's policies, did meso-level officials' actions decouple from the center's goals? And how do we understand this decoupling during this wave of re-centralization? So I focus explicitly on 2 underdeveloped provinces in Shanxi and Henan. And here's a little map of where I went in China. And they have sort of different material and cultural understandings of coal that inform outcomes that I'll talk about in a second. So I spent 11 months doing ethnographic fieldwork in Shanxi, Henan, and Beijing. I have done a ton of interviews, which you can see here. Yeah, so we can get into sort of how that went in the discussion section, but generally, I just talked to people and witnessed what was happening. So we have to understand environmental governance in China. And to answer that first question, I inductively come up with this idea of mechanism design. And to answer this latter 2 questions, this concept of interstitial resourcefulness. And if you ever go back to the program, you'll see it says débrouillardise. Sorry, it's 6 in the morning, so my French is a little rusty. So I changed it to resourcefulness for my American colleagues. But the general idea here is that Beijing sees itself as a mechanism designer. So it sees itself as an entity that can create create policies to ensure compliance from lower level officials. So there's, in response to a rampant corruption and implementation gaps in policy, and environmental policy more specifically, the central state has promoted a new model of top-level design governance. So the central state views itself as a mechanism designer through these hard attempts at re-centralizing state power from the meso level to the central and national level. This is a category of practice that must be understood if we are to understand the changing incentive structures for the carrot and stick for meso-level actors. So the carrot here is promotion, and the stick is demotion or stagnation in your career, firing and or arrest and fines. So Beijing has created a promotion tournament that includes environmental targets that says if you don't meet these environmental targets that we have made, you are at risk for demotion. You're at risk of getting kicked out of the party if it's egregious enough, as we saw in Xi'an recently, and you can even be arrested. So the idea is that Beijing sees itself as a designer of mechanisms that can align meso-level and local level rational interests to what Beijing desires. So the central state then is a principle with a clear idea of policy goals and a plan on implementing these goals. But meso-level actors have their own interests and design, which leads to either accepting Beijing's policies, reconfiguring them in some ways, and or rejecting them outright. And that process then is called, they do that through interstitial resourcefulness. So interstitial resourcefulness is the process of accepting, reconfiguring, or rejecting central state environmental policies due to differing constellations of power, interests, and pressures, as well as the skills involved that these meso-level actors have. So the process is interstitial because it is located at the niches between the power structures of civil society, the central state, and capital, and between the central government up top and the lower levels below. So not only are the offices interstitial, but so too are the people. And that's sort of a really important distinction that we don't really make that much in the Chinese literature. We sort of have this sort of monolithic view of the state that really conflicts with the empirical reality on the ground. So, so that's sort of the interstitial part of it. And then the resourcefulness part of it is this ability to demystify or defog, which happens with a combination of know-how, an ability to cope with the unknown, ingenuity, astuteness, the ability to get oneself out of trouble, and the ability to understand, use, and create cultural tools. So it's sort of similar to bricolage in a lot of ways, but whereas bricolage is constructing something with a clear fixed idea of what you need to build and the resources required to build it, resourcefulness is both the process of figuring out what needs to be done, how to do it, and with what tools. So interstitial resourcefulness helps us to understand both the structural and personal actions of meso-level state actors and the different interests, values, and relations that these actors have and use, which then help us explain differential environmental implementations and outcomes. So basically, there's a constellation of pressures for the meso-level state. There are international norms that affect the central state, which have created, in a lot of ways, these environmental policies that we've seen. And the central state then creates these policies tasked to the meso-level state to implement, but the meso-level state has to contend with other ministries at the horizontal level and the local state in a vertical level. So even within the state, there are multiple pressure points, different interests, different values, and these are both professional and personal. And then the meso-level state also has to deal with local capital, and in coal bosses, both legal and illegal. And they also have to deal with coal miners and other civil society actors. And while we may think of China as not having a vibrant civil society sphere, it still does exist. So we can see that the meso-level state then is dealing with a bunch of different interests, pressures, and relationships that must be empirically examined through time and space. And that is sort of where my intervention occurs, but I'm trying to keep it to a tight 15. So we can sort of talk about that in the discussion section if we want, if you want to hear more about this. But I'm sort of going to leave off here and say that environmental development is one of the most critical state functions, especially as states move away from fossil fuel reliant industrialization. So how states actually implement their environmental policies and the pressures, interests, and relationships that affect implementation is crucial both empirically and theoretically. And these policies garner resistance even within the state itself. So understanding why states fail to implement environmental policy effectively will help us close the gap between environmental policies and the lived reality of these policies on the ground. And understanding the state's environmental governance processes informs our understandings of state-led economic development, state capital, state labor, and capital labor relationships, and climate change politics more broadly. And I guess that is sort of where I will leave off. Kept it to, I think, 15 minutes exactly. So.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Daniel. And I actually thought it was even earlier in the morning. So that's not quite.
We started at 5, so now it's.
Well done. I see you've got a drink there anyway. So any questions for clarification to Daniel? Richard?
Well,
you're muted. Sorry.
All right, after all this time, there's no excuse.
That old chestnut.
5 o'clock in the morning either, but yes, thanks, Daniel. I really enjoyed that, and I think you're absolutely right. There's a real need to understand the sort of the internal dynamics of policy processes of states, how they function. So I've got lots of questions, and it resonates with some sort of theoretical approaches that I'm interested in, the work of Norman Long and Lipsky and all of that sort of negotiation and interface. But I just wonder, and maybe this is sort of encroaching on the sort of the discussion period, but how do these sort of actors that you're focusing on, how do they talk about what they're doing? Do they talk about it as resisting the enforcement of policy, or do they say they're doing it, but they're massaging it in some ways?
Yeah, so this is a great question. And some outrightly say, like, no, we're not doing these, we're not going to implement these policies. And we can get into sort of how and why that happens. But, I have had people tell me that, these policies are coming from dumbasses who know nothing about the lived reality on the ground. And, they're sort of like these effete Beijingers who don't understand how, like, us real men in the coal mining regions survive. So that's one extreme. The other, the sort of more normal is not necessarily we're going to reject them, but there's this idea that the great thing about standards is there's so many to choose from. So this idea is they're asking too much of us, so we're just going to pick and choose and then play these standards off of each other. And that's sort of the most common way that they do it. There's also, deflection processes where they say, like, I would love to do this, but I can't for XYZ reasons. So there is some outright resistance within the state, which I go into a lot because, that's why we love ethnographies. But it's mostly people aren't that bold.
Thanks, that's great.
Okay, thank you. Naomi?
Hi there. No, that was really interesting. And like Richard, I'm also looking at policy, and you looking at policy translation, the role of local state. And I'm very much engaging with the bricolage literature. So I was quite interested in your distinction between resourcefulness and bricolage, and why you felt that bricolage didn't quite do it for you. And I wondered if you could kind of clarify or elaborate on that. But also you talk about the meso-state, and I'm not very familiar with Chinese context. So I wondered what the meso-state is in China, and yeah, because you also had the local state on your diagram.
Yeah, so thank you. These are great questions. So I am heavily indebted to sort of the bricolage literature. But the sort of the idea of bricolage is that you have a blueprint in a lot of ways, right? That you have the tools necessary, you know what those tools are, and you have sort of a clear idea of what you're building. And that doesn't really happen in the Chinese context. So there's this sort of hidden information, hidden knowledge aspect that I think, if you go to sort of a hardware store and say, I'm trying to build something, I don't know what it is, I don't know what I need. They can't help you that much, but, and that's sort of the difference. it's also, I think that the French is actually really helpful for this distinction as well. So like the system D is like getting out of the weeds and getting out of trouble in a lot of ways. And sort of that's a big part of resourcefulness is you're in trouble. How do we get out of that using the skills that we have? So that's sort of where I'm trying to make a distinction between bricolage and this resourcefulness. And then the meso level comes about so in China, both in sort of practice and theory, there's only a distinction between the local level and the national level. But that local level then is collapsing 5 rungs of government from the community-based, which can rule over 300 people, to the provincial level, which is a local level as well. And Henan has 100 million people. So it doesn't really make sense to have those collapse together. So I make the distinction between sort of the lowest level of government, the ones that are sort of street level bureaucrats, and more communal, village, township, and a higher level that have a wider sort of jurisdiction, and also then become the principal to those agents. Does that sort of help clarify?
It does, although I would slightly disagree with you on bricolage, but anyway, I think there are different interpretations of it.
Well, I think what might be interesting, if I maybe come in here a bit, is what literature do you mean when you're talking about how you're understanding bricolage? Because I think there are probably quite a few of us here have maybe different understanding. So specifically, that would be, if you don't mind, telling us which sources you're referring to.
Yeah, so this is also the problem with Americans and Europeans. We generally don't interact with each other that often.
Well, we've got the opportunity now, so.
I know, so
well,
I'm here.
What does you do anyway?
I'm here to represent us.
Yeah,
so
you did a good
job. So Erin McDonald has a book about African developments, and that's sort of where I'm coming from, and sort of that stream of bricolage. But I would love to hear more about sort of your stream. But the Erin Metz McDonald is sort of where I'd make my intervention and sort of arguing more against. Yeah, Naomi.
Naomi, you can come back in on that one.
Yeah, I was just to say that I tend to draw on Frances Cleaver's work, and her definition of bricolage sounds a lot like your definition of resourcefulness. So I don't think there necessarily has to be a big difference, but yeah, it depends how you use the term, because other people use it much more in terms of a way of crafting institutions, which is a much more conscious process. But I don't think Frances Cleaver uses it in that way. So yeah, it's interesting to see.
She sort of calls it more organic, doesn't she? Sort of more
unconscious and unconscious.
Yeah, unconscious.
Yeah. So yeah, just interested in the differences there.
Okay, right. Thank you very much for that. Before I go to Richard, who hasn't long spoken unless it's immediately about this, I just want to remind you you could use the chat function to write your questions in there if you'd prefer to do that. Otherwise, please do put your hands up, either physically, preferably with your cameras on though, or using the hands raised icon thing. But as we're waiting for other questions, well, anyone else want to ask a question before I come back to Richard? Oh, Richard, are you still wanting to speak? You see, yeah, good.
Yeah, I found the mute button. So I do have lots of questions, but I think one thing that springs to mind is, how do you think the central government sees policy and policy implementation? Does it recognize this level of messiness and negotiation? And if so, how does that recognition shape how it approaches policy?
Yeah, definitely. They definitely view this as sort of a messy process, but they're trying to control that messiness. And this is something we've seen since 2012 and sort of Xi Jinping's rise, and more explicitly since 2014. and the new 5-year plans that she has been in charge of. And the general idea is that they're trying to re-tighten policy. So China goes through this sort of back and forth of loosening up and letting sort of local actors and meso-level actors do whatever they want, and then tightening back up to the center. And we're in this sort of tightening phase where Beijing has really tried to limit local and meso-level actors' discretion. And they've done this through a lot of policies. The biggest one that when I was there, I saw was the Sweep Away the Black Influences campaign, which is supposed to be a anti-corruption campaign, but really became sort of a party purge for those who weren't following the sort of mandates of the party. And that's sort of how Beijing has tried to deal with this messiness, that they do recognize this, but they are also trying to control that through these mechanisms that they're designing, mostly through the promotion tournament. Does that answer?
Well, yes. I mean, we could go on, but
Yeah.
Thanks.
Thank you. Any other questions? Otherwise, I might just jump in while you're. Oh, Claire, go on then. Claire, you go before me then.
Sure, you can.
Yeah, no, go on.
So I just had a question for Abhinita and for Les, because Les had mentioned the education systems. I was just wondering if how the education systems in both contexts in Odisha and in the part of Brazil you're in, Les, of whether that is supporting these kind of indigenous resistance or sense of identity, or kind of the cultural aspects that you were discussing, or whether that's kind of also being undermined.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, until a few years ago, depending on which town, the education system had at least implicitly a model of modernizing or assimilating everyone. And that means in every aspect of life, agricultural modernization, meaning technology packages of the Green Revolution, which is a very well-known concept throughout Latin America, less well-known here as just the name for it. And devaluing traditional cultures, that means all aspects, language, dance, song. So this assault on their traditions provoked eventually a collective response, demanding what they call educação diferenciada, meaning culturally differentiated, specific to each of those three communities, but at the same time with resonances across them, because they're all in each in their own way, they're asserting so communal values as expressed in the mutirao tradition of mutual aid. And eventually, each town by town of those three towns in the Balkaina were persuaded to adopt this policy and began developing them seriously in collaboration, in fact, with those communities. And in fact, in one of them, there was a brilliant idea to have a student exercise. It is students collectively develop specific plans for this differentiated education, so that they could somehow act as a bridge between those traditions and the current day difficulties of those communities. And that also contributed to the community-based tourism as a way of interesting visitors in their ways of life and their efforts towards a solidarity economy. So at least in this particular region, there has been a significant success in that alternative form. Well, now it's no longer alternative. It's well established after several years. It's educação diferenciada.
Yeah.
And so that's a good example for what can be achieved by traditional communities in other coastal areas of the continent.
Mm-hmm.
So in Orissa, actually, it's very interesting that 5 years ago, a boarding school emerged, which particularly developed with an aim to cater to the needs of the indigenous communities in Orissa. But unfortunately, what happened is that many students who went to those boarding schools, they barely got time to come back home. And in that way, they again became a part of the development process, which they were trying to resist back home. So in this way, I think the education system didn't do much in cultivating their tradition. But the thing is that a lot of awareness has been generated because decades back, very few people heard about cons, except maybe anthropologists and sociologists. But I think a lot of people now, the ordinary people, are aware of cons. And in a way, that has also encouraged tourism, but it has not actually gave rise to any sort of awareness about an alternative practice regarding food and land. And those who are studying within the village communities in schools which are closer to the local community, they also faced the same issues because mostly the education system here is very homogenized, where you do not find the cultural ideas and values of these communities are not included in the curriculum. So yeah, so that's a barrier. And many of them who are going back to schools are also imbibing the ideas of new materialism and development, and they see their own community as backward.
Thank you. It's really interesting contrast across the two
Yeah.
parties.
Thank you.
Yeah, let me just add briefly, perhaps a point that's relevant to all three talks. And that is, of course, this is all about promoting a different form of economy, a solidaristic resource conservation form of economy, inspired by concepts such as bem viver or buen vivir, which is originally indigenous concept from the Andean parts of South America. And so it has resonances throughout the continent in both directions, because then this alternative development is seen as a showcase for what's possible by drawing on, extending those traditions. So perhaps this could be posed as a general question that, effects on what's called officially environment, but really means natural resources, ecological relationships, depend on the particular economic development model. And of course, these are everywhere in a contested matter, rival models. So this could be a general question for all three talks. What are the contested relationships between economic development and natural resources? I mean, this was somewhat explicit in the talks on Brazil and India, but in China, it could be a question because all these meso-level actors, or whatever you're going to call them, surely have stronger pressures for a particular form of economic development, which thereby limit the fulfillment of environmental protection targets.
Yeah, that did seem to be the sort of strong message there of the fieldwork from Daniel. Benita, I don't know if you want to come in there, or I think that was very much, I think the contested nature of different approaches to development, whatever you call development, were apparent in your presentation, but I don't know if there's anything you want to add.
I think in India, the problem is also that, especially in Orissa, there was, I don't know if anyone has heard of it, but there's in Raigada district, there's a hilly region called the Niyamgiri Hills, where a majority of corn tribes live, and it's quite inaccessible, so I was not able to conduct my fieldwork there. And I have noticed that after they protested against the Vedanta Industries, which was trying to actually build a coal mining industry in the land. So they worship the mountain and they consider it as God. So they protested and they played out movie scenes from Avatar, and they were very successful in that. But after that, when I went to the region, I saw that many people have been knowingly excluded from many of these benefits that the government provides, not officially, but things such as road or water facilities are not being given to them. So I think many ways the state also doesn't support. So there is this particular way of looking at development, I think, that dominates, like in India and particularly in Orissa. So the contestation I'm not very sure about, because the alternative movements are still in the fringes now. So, yeah.
Okay, I think I might jump in, as I've got a few minutes maybe, to ask a question to Abhinita. Yeah, I really enjoyed your presentation, though I found it a little bit depressing, but there was some hope in there as well, perhaps. So I wondered if you were able to give some policy recommendations from your research. What would they be, and how could the concept of justice inform those policy recommendations? Might be a bit.
Because for anything to work out in this region, I think the first thing should be, there's a lot of hierarchies, local hierarchies. For example, the very rigid caste system there. And also to some extent there is, because earlier in tribal society, there was no gender balance, but now it's also emerging as a problem. So I think for anything to work there, including justice and access to resources, first we need to, negotiate these hierarchies, because, and it's going to be very difficult because it's very rigid there. So first policy implementation would be to perhaps generate a sense of awareness within the tribal community and within even the Dalit communities about those hierarchies. But that would be only possible when we have some people, especially activists and NGOs, who would go there and engage in such conversations, but those are very limited in this area. I think there's only one organization known as the Living Farms who are working in this area, but they are not able to do enough because there are around 300 villages. So I think if something of that sort be done, would ensure a better environment in social justice, because social justice has to be there for environmental justice to be there. Yeah.
Thank you. Are there any other questions or contributions that anyone else would like to make?
Perhaps the question I asked in general about the relationship with economic development and environment or resources. Perhaps Daniel would like to say something.
Yeah, I think that is sort of the question that states have to grapple with, right? Basically, how, especially sort of industrializing states, and this is something that China has argued in many fora across time, that you all got to develop with fossil fuels, yet when we tried to develop with fossil fuels, we're harassed and harangued. But there has been this sort of concerted effort at the national level to shift the basis of the base of their economy from fossil fuel reliant development to the service industry, IT tech industry, sort of internet and financialization, rather than heavy industry or light industry, and that could be sort of the thing that we all hate to say, but like financialization is a lot less environmentally damaging in a lot of ways than coal mining. It's damaging in every other way, but again, so is coal mining. But the problem then is, how do you get these areas that are reliant on fossil fuels, whose culture is reliant on fossil fuel? How do you get them on board with these policies, because while it is great and dandy to say, yeah, we should move away from coal, what happens to these coal workers? What happens to these officials who rely on coal to, economically develop, to fill their coffers, their local coffers, to support the social safety net? It's I think the sort of fundamental question of the century.
And do they offer any particular sort of help or assistance for those regions then, given their dependence on coal?
Not particularly. Some regions are, they get, so one region that I studied in sort of the northeast of Henan got about $5 billion to turn coal mines into parks. So there is some government support materially, but mostly the government support is, if you don't do this, you're going to be in trouble, rather than if you do this, we're going to give you a benefit. And I think changing that incentive structure would be a way to move beyond coal, but the sort of problem is China still needs coal. China's still steel reliant, and there's still most of the grid is still coal based. So I think there's just too many incentives not to do it.
Naomi.
This is taking things in a slightly different direction and is perhaps a bit more of a generic question. But given that we're quite interested in this panel and as researchers in kind of being critical, but also in justice, I just wondered how you saw your role as researchers. I guess this is a question for all the presenters. How you see your role as researchers in terms of whether advocating or being involved in these social movements or kind of policy change. Like, how do you see your role in that kind of as activists or as influencers? Or maybe you don't. Maybe you just want to be a critical voice.
Who would like to answer that?
Well, I could try. I've thought about this for several decades. Well, I've always worked as much as possible with civil society groups in the research projects I've done, mainly in European context and sometimes in this country, but now in the last 3 years in Latin America. And the two projects I have there were designed with a partnership from the start, through discussions with them and building those civil society partners into the structure and the funding for the project. And there has been need for much discussion, well, even more so during the pandemic, which totally disrupted our original research plan, because we had to just find online methods as alternatives to the in-person events and methods that we originally planned. There's been much discussion then about how they are shifting their economic activities, these circuitos cortos, short food supply chains, in ways that adapt to the pandemic, but also continue the income to those small-scale agroecological producers, and then how this involves rethinking the concepts that had already guided them, such as solidarity economy solidaria. And for me, it was a pleasant experience to engage with many of the concepts that were more specific to Latin America. So I had to, let's say, educate myself by understanding how they were using the concept of territorial development in ways quite different than the hegemonic or mainstream use of those terms. and how they understood this as a conflict between continuing neo-colonial development models or modernization models versus their alternatives, which had various names. So I needed to educate myself, let's say, in order to understand better how to engage with their activities and their changes since the pandemic, and then how to, let's say, translate both ways between the, say, mainstream academic concepts in the English language literature and those which are, have been elaborated in Latin America through collaboration, engagement between academics there and their civil society partners. And in these projects, I see my role as perhaps helping to play that kind of translation role and facilitating the development of these concepts across the partners in these very different contexts. I mentioned just one of the 3 case studies. The other 2 are quite different. But we try to find ways of developing the general analytical concepts in ways that have resonance with their diverse experiences, especially solidarity economy, food sovereignty, territorialized development as their special take on the concept territory. So that's how I see my engagement, and also to strengthen their capacity or to demand the policy improvements that could better serve their alternatives. And that means at every level, from the municipality to the state or regional government, and ideally the federal government, but that's almost impossible at this stage in Brazil, but now possible in Bolivia, thanks to these, let's say, return of the MAS government.
Okay, thank you. Abenita and Daniel, do you have any reflections on that? Abenita, do you want to go?
For me, I was unfortunately there for a very short period of time, and then the pandemic hit. So I've not been able to go back there again. And it's quite far from the city I'm staying, and it takes around 24 hours by train. So, so the short while I was there, during my fieldwork, I was asked this question many times by the tribals that if they talk to me and if they tell me about themselves, how will it benefit them? And will it help them, especially financially? And many of them thought that I'm a government official or I work for the government. So they were suspicious at first. But then when they opened up, I also realized that I'm here to see the problems, and maybe I can write and make policy recommendations at some point, but also I'm not capable of actually solving any problems which they have there. So I told them that. So I see my role just as a researcher, and in a way I learned a lot from them, and I didn't give back much. I learned that because the place I'm staying and my background, we have a very different sense of development practices and culture. And when you go to such an environment, you find that people are actually struggling in the everyday life, and still they find certain solutions to their problems, being in a subsistence economy. So that's what my takeaway was.
Okay, thank you. Daniel.
Yeah, so I love this question and I hate it at the same time, because I then have to think critically about my own self, which is but so I'd just like to say that very few people thought I was a state spy in China. So that is one benefit that I had. But so I think my work really sort of builds off of what you both were saying, is that you're fighting and groups are fighting for policy implementation and policy change, but we need to actually examine how that policy is implemented. And I think by bringing light to how policies are actually implemented, we can then help these groups figure out how they can then get the policy implemented that they fought to get enacted. So that's sort of how I see my role. I did work with one NGO in Henan more specifically, but I really do think that, you know, the role of academics doesn't have to be academic in the second definition of it, right? It can be instrumental, and by shedding light, by saying this is how these processes happen, we can then help people understand and confront the sort of power imbalances that they're dealing with.
Naomi, did you want to come back at all on that? I see you've just put something in the chat.
No, I mean, I know that's it. I agree, it's a question that I also kind of I feel the same about. You don't always want to, you start to criticize yourself for not being influential enough. But I think I just also found at a very simple level that sometimes the people I spoke to just weren't ever listened to in that way by other people. They didn't have a chance. There wasn't anyone else who was necessarily interested in their everyday experiences or what it was like to be the junior, the extension worker at the bottom of the hierarchy. And I think although it was limited, there's a bit of a sense of empowerment there as well, and just in being a voice, I mean, in being a sympathetic ear.
Yeah.
And sort of reaffirming them as sort of, for me, sociological and historical agents, right? That yeah, this is something that often people ask me, like, why are you talking to me? Like, I'm nobody, like, go to Beijing and talk to people. But yeah, so that affirmation of self at a more micro level is also really important.
Great. Okay. Finally, Claire.
Oh, now I feel pressure. I was only just gonna add to that, just in saying it kind of struck me how different the place and the role and the space for civil society is in the three presentations that we heard, and that will influence what position you can take as researchers. I mean, in India, it's terrible at the moment for civil society organizations, so it doesn't surprise me, Abhinita, when you're saying there's very few in Niyamgari, even though it's a well-known area. Even that area hasn't allowed for many organizations to try and support politically, or overtly politically, at least, even if they're doing things maybe in a quieter manner behind the scenes a little bit in organizing people. But yeah, it just struck me that there's bound to be a difference in what you can do and at what time you can do things as a researcher, depending on the strength, the space, the political space as well for civil society. And as Daniel was talking about, kind of resistance from outside and within, state organizations will of course also depend on what that outside looks like and how civil society is organized or not, and the pressures it's facing. So it's something I've often reflected on in work in India, because it really depends where you are, which state, whether there's any way at all to be able to work with civil society. So yeah, maybe we shouldn't be too harsh on ourselves, but look for opportunities where they're there.
And the ideas of civil society is also very different in India, because we don't have a clear-cut, very westernized definition of civil society. I think the NGOs and volunteers and the self-help groups were around there. They also tend to, break up and come back together. So you never have a concrete civil society group as such, and particularly in Raigada, which is a very remote area. So only I think for the past 10 to 15 years, there are some groups who are showing an interest in it. Otherwise, it was a quite neglected part of Odisha. And still there's a lot of poverty in the region, malnutrition. So, yeah.
Okay, I like that comment from Daniel in the chat then. My favorite thing is government organized NGO. Yeah, maybe not quite the non then. Gone goes. Right, well, thank you all very much. Thank you for the excellent presentations. I think we've had, I didn't stay much, unfortunately, on Tuesday, but I think we've had a great 3 sessions. And so thank you all very much for your contributions. If you're not on the mailing list of the Environment, Natural Resources and Climate Change all-encompassing study group, please do drop me an email and I'll get you on the mailing list, and we'll hope to organise a meeting soon and perhaps take some of these conversations forward. So I wish you all a good day, and get ready for the next plenary session.